So there's a lot of talk about the new pope, obviously, but amongst traditionalists, there seems to be a trend or a stream of a type of despair or doomerism or something. And the thinking basically goes, look at this man, Pope Leo the 14th. He has said this about synodality. He said he's pro-collegiality, all these things. He wants to, continue with the legacy of his predecessor and whatnot. Yeah, those are all things that are legitimate, red flags. But I think a little historical perspective is necessary. And I also think that I think there's a bit of short-sightedness and maybe some rose-colored glasses about what came before Francis. When you look into the history of Pope Benedict, for example, and the reason I'm bringing up Pope Benedict is I think all of us could agree that if we had someone who governed like Pope Benedict versus someone who governed like Pope Francis, things would objectively have been a lot better. I think that's just obvious. But Pope Benedict said many of the same things that we're finding out that Pope Leo has said before he was Pope. In fact, Pope Benedict was called a modernist by one of his professors when he was a young student, as a young priest. Pope Benedict, when he was Father Ratzinger, he was speaking, and I have this in my book, What Happened to Catholicism, for example. He was adamant that there were errors in the scriptures and that biblical inerrancy did not apply to historical matters, completely contradicting Pope Leo the 13th and very solemn teaching. Before Benedict was Pope, you look into the writings of the great traditionalist authors, and Cardinal Ratzinger is seen as this arch-liberal, and he really was. Compared to the pre-conciliar consensus, Cardinal Ratzinger was suspected of modernism. But then something happened when he became Pope. He still kept all his views. If you actually read his writings, they're very consistent. But he governed like a half-decent Pope. And he seemed to have a tender heart and didn't hate the traditional Mass, and he wanted to do his best to help out traditionalists because he thought it was necessary. He loved collegiality. He loved synodality. People forget that he had synods, and the synods started with Paul VI and JP2, and Ratzinger helped JP2 write all of his crazy stuff. Ratzinger did Assisi meetings, or one of them at least. He did other stuff. They called Ratzinger the Green Pope. What did he do? He installed a bunch of solar plant panels or something at the Vatican to try to make it carbon neutral or something like that. I remember when I was a teacher, they were trying to show us because they loved Pope Francis, because they were all, liberals, and they were trying to prove that actually Benedict was just as liberal. And they had all these, all this evidence of all the environmentalist stuff he had done and said. All of these cardinals, every single one of them, is touched by some sort of modernism. It's just the way it is. What people have optimism about is that actions themselves speak louder than words, and it seems positive that Pope Leo came out in the proper vestments, that he used the old school Latin blessing, that he did his first Mass, albeit Novus Ordo, but in Latin, that he, had the classic decorum that you would expect in a dignified setting, and that, he used his first moment speaking to the world to preach about Christ and to pray the Hail Mary with the world, things that just kind of seem Catholic. Now, there are red flags in his past, but there are red flags in your past, aren't there? I find the absolutist kind of judgment to be kind of unhelpful. I mean, every single one of you is like deserving of going to hell, because we all are. Every single one of us. Unless you happen to be the Virgin Mary or John the Baptist or, some incredible saint, you're like a terrible human being, objectively, compared to the glory of God, as we all are. And unless you happen to be raised in a really good traditional Catholic family, where you were taught real well from day one, you probably had a progression in how you believed things. So we have no idea if the things that Pope Leo said when he was a younger man, as he's aged, as he's gained experience, we have no idea what that means about how he's going to govern, whether he stands by everything he said, and so forth. And there's also a host of statements we can find from him that are pretty good, if I'm being honest. What we want out of a pope, if we're being realistic, is we want a pope who is a nice man, who is a kind man, who doesn't want to make people unhappy, who doesn't want to govern like a tyrant, who doesn't want to destroy the tradition of the church, who just is a father. As I said, Pope Benedict's views were consistent with JP2, Paul VI, and Pope Francis on virtually everything. Now, Pope Benedict was a much more intelligent academic type, so he had tons of other writings on things like music and so forth, where a lot of intellectuals and traditionalists could kind of sink their teeth into. That's true. But as far as his theology, you could find so much modernism in it if you wanted to. And I write about that in my book, and I don't hold back. You can find a ton of modernism in Pope Benedict. But he governed like a Catholic. And he was very helpful to tradition. And if you look at Pope Leo, people keep saying he's like Pope Francis's protege. I don't know. I don't find that. There's a lot of stuff with him, with this kinship and this closeness and this respect he had for Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict was very Augustinian, and Pope Leo is an Augustinian. Pope Leo has been saying the traditional Latin Mass on his own for a long time. I really think that it's not what people are. I don't think that the statements and the sort of doomer kind of black pill judgment thing about Pope Leo, I don't think they fit. And ultimately, you're not going to get a traditionalist in any true sense out of any of these cardinals. The Cardinal Sarahs, the Cardinal Burkes, etc. They all worship the Second Vatican Council. I'm speaking metaphorically, but they all think you should Vatican II harder and so forth. Not a single one of them is going to do away with the Novus Ordo, do away with Vatican II. None of them. So we just have to wait and see what he's going to do. When he talks about synodality, for example, in his statements from earlier today, he said he wanted to follow Pope Francis's footsteps, and he was taking these citations from Evangelii Gaudium. But when you look at what he said, it was very interesting because, he wanted to help continue with popular piety, for example. What is popular piety? Well, popular piety includes what the faithful see as meaningful to themselves, which includes the traditional Mass. He wanted to continue with synodality. Well, what does that mean? I mean, synodality, the way it was done, is ridiculous, but a lot of the bishops reported and a lot of the dioceses reported that they love the TLM, and Pope Francis just seemed to ignore that. Does that mean that Pope Leo is going to say, well, with our synodal process, we have found that the way forward is, to give the people the popular piety, to inspire blah, 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 and this includes greater access to the traditional Mass? Maybe. We don't know. So those, crying, Santo Subito, like he's the second coming of Pius X, you need to get a grip. But those who are, basically, looking for somewhere to put their head through a wall, and hoping for a meteor and the end times, you probably also need to find a way to get a grip, just being honest. Wait and see what he does. Now, if he's awful, he's awful. But The fact that he said things that sound like Vatican II, it's like, what else did you expect would happen? Again, Benedict was the same. Benedict was the exact same. There was tons of modernism in Pope Benedict. There just was. But everyone who loves the Catholic tradition would agree that, man, oh man, did he govern a lot better than Pope Francis. And so we hope for something similar as a step in the right direction. And then we wait for the demographic cliff to finally show up, and the boomer Vatican II obsessed generation dies off, and they didn't reproduce theologically or physically because they all ignored the teachings of the church. And the younger generation is traditional. And that's just what it's going to be. And there was going to be no pope that we were going to get that was going to usher that in any artificial way faster than it would come. We can hope for a nice man, a kind man, a tender man who loves his children, all of them, the traditionalists and non-traditionalists, who is helpful and who lets us have the tradition. And that's what we pray for. That's it. Everyone needs to kind of chill out.